series on crime and punishment. And Alan, I know you can maybe see the back of my head. Our teacher for, I think most of you have been here the prior weeks, is Alan Bernstein, who's a professor emeritus of medieval history at University of Arizona. And as I've indicated, also was my medieval history professor, which was my favorite class ever when I was an undergraduate at Stanford. He notably, I always hold this up because I certainly encourage you to look at it. It is available at the Multnomah County Library, The Formation of Hell, The Death and Retribution in the Ancient Early Christian Worlds that Alan wrote. I have been reading it, and it really is outstanding and incredibly authoritative on all subjects that are very much related to different subjects that we have talked about and people that we've talked about in adult ed over the last, 15 years. So anyway, with that, the first week, again, was focused on Satan. The last week on hell, or the concept of hell. And this week, we go to more current modern times. So Alan, that I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, John, thank you very much. And I appreciate the introductions you've given each week. So I remind our audience of the early conversation we had where you proposed that I speak about the devil. And I said, I don't do the devil, I do hell. And a subtle distinction from most people, but it allowed me to focus. And you said, good negotiator that you are. Okay, that's 2 lectures. What would you like to do for the third? And we talked about it for a little while and decided that the third one would be earthly punishment instead of punishment in the other world. And so we're turning now to the system of incarceration in the United States today. I have to say it's been difficult to get statistics and accounts of what's going on actually right now in 2025 or 2024. These articles I've read date from the 1990s, some books, important books from the 1980s. So there's some generality to what I'm going to say, but this is an enormous field, penology, criminology, and it blends with everything from sociology, anthropology, economics, psychology. It's just a hugely complex subject. And boiling it down to a 45 or 50-minute lecture is as tough a task as getting my 40 years of research on hell into 1 hour. So I hope that what will happen is that some of what I say will stimulate some of you to pursue some topics. And believe me, no matter what you pick, it will take you down a fascinating and I must say fairly depressing road, but one that will pay dividends if we find things to do to improve the situation. So I'm going to try to end with some recommendations. So today's lecture has 4 parts. The causes of crime, which I think we have to review because it has to do with how we evaluate the success of punishment. Does punishment achieve its goals or not? Does it help or does it harm the victim of the punishment who actually, presumably, and that's a heavy word, right, in that context, presumably guilty of some crime. And it's very important, we must evaluate whether the inmate has benefited or been harmed from the discipline imposed by society. And then we'll also ask, who is society in this system? What functional role does society play? And that will draw on many of the observations we've made during the past 2 weeks. And then from there, I will end with some recommendations, some of my own reflections, and we'll see where to go from there. And I will leave time for questions, which I welcome very much. So let's get started. The causes of crime, a tiny topic, as you can all imagine. I want to point to a book that I read a few years ago that changed the way I think about lots of themes that are important to me and to this group. It's by Robert Sapolsky, a professor of psychology now at Stanford, formerly at Harvard. And the book is called Behave. And he's interested in precisely this, the causes of our behavior, including our illegal behavior. And he makes a point that is searingly germane to the subjects that we're discussing. And they have to do with the not just early childhood of the future perpetrator, but even the situation of the fetus in utero before birth, having to do with genetic factors of the parents and of the condition of the mother, then the infancy of the individual, whether they live in scarcity, for example, in
Alan, I don't know if you can hear us, but you froze. So,
and that's another factor. What about the children of people who are incarcerated? What is the effect on the growing child of the incarceration of a parent? That's something I never thought about until I started the work for today's lecture. And then there's the possibility of abuse from a parent or a relative or a policeman or a sadistic teacher or who knows, a neighbor, a bully. These influences can impede brain development, as I said, even before birth, and they affect the ability of a growing child, starting at birth, to develop the mental skills needed to function in the world. Things like theory of mind, which is a technical term in psychology. It's the ability of a person to understand that other people have other ideas. We're not talking about political discourse here. We're talking about understanding that a person standing on the top of a hill has a different view of a valley from somebody standing on the banks of the river that runs through it. And if you don't understand that, you're handicapped in understanding all kinds of even more complex situations. That's a real handicap. Anyway, I'm going on much too long. on Robert Sapolsky. It's a very, very difficult, important book, 700 pages long, worth the effort for every page. Okay, another cause of criminality is psychology, the need for revenge, greed, envy. I'll just sum it up with the vices. We need better words for the vices, words that you don't learn in Sunday school, that are not part of a fixed list. What does sloth say to most people today? It's a word that has to be explained. We need to replace a word like sloth and others that can. Pride. What does pride actually say to a person? Uh, so there's a lot of work that can be done to warn people about impulses that they have to learn to resist to the extent that we're able to. So I refer you back to the lecture on the devil. Okay, then there are sociological causes of crime, such as wealth inequality. I'll let that phrase just sit there, but the observation is that in the United States, over the last 50 years, the difference between the very wealthy and the very poor has grown by a tremendous factor, and it causes resentment and it on the part of the poor, and it causes defensiveness on the part of the very wealthy. Anybody who subscribes to a newspaper or reads any blogs knows all about that. I will say no more. And then there's compulsion. People can be forced to commit crimes by their peers who tell them they must come along, they must wear the red or the blue or the green, which is the color of the gang, and commit their initiatory crime. The same is true of joining terrorist cells. And it could be said that in certain corporations or in certain government programs under certain administrations, you must show your loyalty to the policy that is now official by doing certain acts or asking certain questions or refraining from them in order to show your bona fides within that organization. And then, of course, there's the opportunity. So I just summarize that by saying tellers embezzle because they handle money. It's easy to put some in your pocket, but you can generalize from that. So let's go on. We have all these causes of crime. It makes it seem like it'd be virtually irresistible to commit crime. But now, how do we handle it? What do we do with punishment? So, why punish? First of all, there's retribution, payback. And I make a distinction here. There's retribution, which is simply payback, and retaliation. The term has the syllable tal, which is the same as the Latin root for such or such like. And with retaliation, payback is in the same form. It's the idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, where the punishment resembles the crime. So that's one form of retribution. Another reason to punish is to deter crime. If you know you're going to be punished, you're less likely to commit the crime. But there must, in order for deterrence to work, there must be a level of certainty that you will be punished. And if punishment is spotty, that's an encouragement to commit the crime. Then punishment has the advantage of segregating the criminals from the rest of society, and it makes us honest folks safer knowing that the dishonest folks are all behind walls. But I put quotation marks around all and honest and dishonest because the system is not as notionally defined. And then the possibility that the punishment can actually benefit the person being punished. And I will just leave that as an open question because that's what we're going to try to address in the other slides. So what is a prison like? These are two experimental, or they weren't at that, well, they were at the time. These two prisons, Cherry Hill in it was a suburb of Philadelphia when it was founded in 1821, I think, if I have that right, or over in New York. So very early 19th century prison reforms, which thought that solitary confinement would lead to repentance, and they were penitentiaries. And the pun was intentional. They were to repent in there, and they were to meditate on their guilt, and they were to be isolated so they would live with their conscience. It was not a type of punishment such as the whole or solitary confinement is today in the 21st century and much of the 20th, where it was a special added punishment for people in prison who misbehave in prison. And these are isolation cells. There's a big distinction. Please notice in Rikers Island, these doors on the right are solid. So the people in there are, in fact, in a kind of solitary confinement. And these are people who have not been tried. They're being held prior to trial. But they can't see outside their cells. This is in Auburn, New York, the same facility that I just showed you before. But these people can, or I should say, must see across the aisle into the cell of their neighbors. They see everything that their fellow inmates do or can't do, but they can talk to each other. This is Alcatraz, which closed in the early 1960s, but at least this is one prison that I've physically seen, so I think I owe you that level of empiricism, that this is one prison that I know as a tourist. Here, we deal with prison overcrowding because we live in a nation which for many decades, although this is easing since the turn of the century, that is tough on crime. So many people get sent to prison. The trials are not always fair. There are books written which annotate the mistakes made in the trials, the bias, the shortcuts taken by prosecutors and police in different parts of the country, and it's quite horrifying reading. If anybody wants some bibliography on this, I can send it along. So this is a gymnasium that was turned into a dormitory in Alabama, where you see double bunks lined up 6 feet away from one another, no privacy. It's not solitary confinement, but I would have to read diaries written by some of these people to know exactly how difficult it is. And here's another one in California. So it's not only Alabama which does this, but also in California. So here is some indication of the use of incarceration. They used the phrase mass incarceration to describe the situation in the United States. So from 1973 to the end of the century, the number of incarcerated people went from 110 per 100,000 population to 476, a more than fourfold increase in the rate of incarceration. And the sentences were longer. And the statistics are difficult to get because people are shifted back and forth between pre-trial detention in a county jail and actual detention in a state or federal prison. And then there are people who are on probation, on parole. They're all being disciplined by the state, even if they're not actually incarcerated. So the percentage of our fellow Americans who are being disciplined by the state, supervised, is very high. I can't give you a number. I kept looking for one, but it's a tall order. And the populations shift because those in jail or state prison or federal prison are distinct from those who are confined for reasons of their mental health and who are sent to mental health facilities. And again, the statistics are hard to get. So here is a graphic that shows the incarceration growth. Well, you can read this for yourselves. These numbers down here are not easily visible. I'm sure you can't read them, but it starts in 1925, and the big jump occurs, frankly, after the 60s. The tough on crime was a reaction to the assassinations and the riots and the anti-war and the Black Power movement that took place in the 60s. That's my guess. And you just see the whopping multiplication of incarceration growth, but also notice that the trend begins to taper down. There was a big reform movement, and there are websites and there are charitable foundations that try very hard to reduce the number of people in prison. But there's a sinister side to that as well, which has to do with AI and robotics and electronic surveillance that replaces imprisonment. I'll get to that. Here is a chart to show the longer sentences that the black graphic shows life with parole, sentence of life, a life sentence. There are many people in Piper Kernan's book, Yellow is the New Black. She describes the difference in the prison population between those serving short sentences, a year, 3 years, 5 years. 5 years is a short sentence, versus those who are lifers. And we're leaving out capital punishment. I'm not even talking about capital punishment, execution. So here's life without parole grows. There's more of it each year. It remains high after 2012, and then sentences of 50 years or longer. So the trend is greater incarceration. Now, this is based on Piper Kernan's book. I recommend that. It's not on a level with Robert Sapolsky as a life-changing read. At least it wasn't for me, but it's a very good review by a woman who was a Smith College graduate, got involved with some drug trading, and she did money transfers for a drug dealer, and was arrested for that. She didn't actually peddle the drugs herself, but she handled money for the people who did. And reading her book, I came up with all of these individual factors that influence prison life, and they're quite amazing. And one could write a whole book just if you made a chapter out of each one of these bullet points, you would have quite a substantial book. Are you in a light, a minimum or maximum security prison? Are you close to home so your family members can visit you regularly? That was an advantage that she had. Are you allowed visitors? Can you receive mail? Is there a telephone where you can easily call your relatives? And are you charged for the call, and how much? And how does that rate for the call compare to the rates for telephone fees in the broader population? And how do you earn the money to pay the bill for the phone if you're in jail? The length of the sentence, a lot of this is obvious, but when you itemize it like this, to me, it was quite eloquent. Do you have the hope of parole? Is there solidarity with the other inmates? Are you shunned because of your skin color or your religion or the crime you're accused of committing? But you've been convicted, but you may or may not have done it. There are cliques within the prisons, and it goes on and on. There's religious proselytization that goes on in the prison. People join gangs in prisons so that when they get out, they know where they're going. There's abuse from other inmates. That certainly happens. But as Piper Kerman says, there's more danger from the guards than any of the inmates. So one of the themes that I learned in the time I put into this lecture is the conflict between the guards and the prisoners. That is the fundamental fact of prison life. The guards versus those being guarded. We'll get back to that, I think. Then there's the issue of single-sex prisons, because they are. And so then what does one do for sex in the prison? And there are ways to get sex from your fellow inmates. Gay for the stay is the phrase. And then sex imposed on you by the guards or the warden, which apparently is a real risk. And then are you in a dormitory, such as the picture I showed you, or are you in an individual cell, or do you have a cellmate? And then what a difference to have a cellmate, somebody to talk to, but of course you haven't chosen your cellmate the way you choose roommates. So it's not a free situation, obviously. And then I'm going to skip this slide. These are secondary compared to the first slide. Now, solitary confinement in the present day is used as a disciplinary measure in maintaining order within the prison. And it's a threat, and it's clearly horrible. So that there was recently in New York a HALT Act. The HALT, an acronym, Humane Alternatives to Long-Term Solitary Confinement. When this act, so what they did was the legislature in the state of New York limited the extent of solitary confinement that could be used. The guards went on strike because they felt that it would limit their ability to discipline the prisoners whom they're guarding if they couldn't threaten them as much with solitary confinement. So the guards went on strike for 11 days, and the state of New York government said, okay, we will reduce this. But they weakened the HALT Act, so they made the reform for humane alternatives less humane in order to please the guards in 5 prisons in New York State. So that seems to me, that's why I've put it in red and in bold. The major conflict in the prison is between the guards and the prisoners. It's not between the prisoner and their soul. It's not the penance that they're doing for their crime. That does take place. But if you're going to exit prison, you must survive the surveillance and the treatment of the guards. So does it help or harm? So I refer you here to Piper Kerman's book, well worth the read. I've told you about her, so I'm going to skip through this quickly, except to say that her conclusion is that she felt that the people that she met in the prison were worse off exiting than when they entered. And let's just take that as the answer to the question. There's someone who was actually there in a minimum security close to her home. Her husband was able to join her, visit her once a week, which he did for her whole term. About as good a situation as you could get in a prison. And this is still the conclusion that she drew. Another measure of whether the prisons help or harm is recidivism, the fact that people who have been in prison frequently end up back in prison. So 2 out of 3 of them are back within 3 years, and 3 out of 4 of them are back within 5 years. So we note that when the prison system fails, it gets more inmates, which means a bigger population, bigger budgets, and more clout, so that the administrators of the prison can go to the state legislature or the federal legislature, Congress, and ask for more funds. The more funds, the more clout, the bigger the lobby. The suppliers of prison goods make more money, and there are corporations that own some prisons and run them for profit. Privately run prisons, 8% of state and federal prison population is private. And since the 2024 election, so here are some statistics that are up to date. One corporation called Core Civic has its stock went up 40%, and Geo Group's stock doubled in the last 6 months. But clearly the population of the prison is related to the profit that these corporations make. So it's not hard to imagine how they would lobby in Congress and state legislatures. Let's put more people in prison. Let's be tough on crime. So where should we go from here? Now we're getting back to some of the reflections I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture. Who is society? And how do we, society, function? The person who's helped me think most concretely about this is the sociologist Emil Durkheim, he's considered the founder of sociology as a discipline. And Durkheim is very controversial. I put him on a par as a thinker with Marx or Freud. He lived at more or less the same time. He's not generally regarded as important, but I think that's a mistake. For me, he's as important. But critics of Durkheim say that he's guilty of putting society in the role of God and making society they call it society worship. That if you make society an abstraction that is so powerful that you think society does everything, and so individuals are no longer responsible for their own deeds, or we as individuals owe more to the functioning of society than we do to ourselves, that's society worship, and they disparage it and exclude it. I think that's too extreme a criticism, and I think that if you're a person who can deal with the bell-shaped curve, and you know that at extremes you're dealing with statistical improbabilities, but somewhere in the middle there could be some area of constructive thinking. That's the position I take when it comes to Durkheim. And it's not that Durkheim makes society into a divinity. It's the other way around. In my study of religion, I have found that religion propagates itself with metaphors that are social. So if you look at some prayers and expressions that you find in religion, you'll find that God and the divinity or the sacred is expressed in social metaphors. So if you use a prayer that begins, Our Father, our King, as a Jewish prayer that I remember from my childhood, as it does, what is a father? It's an authoritative figure who rules a family, or did when that prayer was composed. A king, the same thing. It's a metaphor. If you think that God is powerful, what's the most powerful thing you can think of? A king, or even a lion. There are prayers where God is addressed as a lion because the most powerful animal in the animal kingdom. Or he is Lord of the universe. What is a Lord? The ruler of all, the same, a ruler. So in other words, the parallel between religion and society is millennia old. And the idea of a redeemer. Redemption is an economic transaction in which a person goes and pays a sum of money to liberate a slave. The slave is redeemed for a sum of money. And in Christianity, that notion gets transmuted in a very constructive way, but the metaphor is social. So Durkheim isn't completely wrong, and the critics are exaggerating. So what we have to do, I think, is say, all right, there is a correlation, and the metaphor works, and it has worked for a long time. And we think of society as an entity which is in a powerful position in the way we think. Now let's go back to Origen of Alexandria. He denied the eternity of hell. He died in 253. He denied the eternity of hell because he believed that if God disciplines a person, that person will benefit, there's that word again, will benefit from the divine attention and the pain of the punishment will cause self-examination and purify the conscience eventually. Augustine of Hippo ridiculed Origen's theory on this. He said, well, if that's true, eventually you would see Satan up there sitting next to the Virgin Mary. Okay, logical extreme. Yes, I get it. But the question of the beneficial effect of discipline is a good question. If suffering corrects the conscience, that's a good thing. And the person who endures the suffering, especially if it's imposed by a loving God or a society which uses its powers fairly, charitably, logically, pick the word, then those who receive society's discipline will come out better. And if not, why not? And why are we just sitting here? So here's my solution. I say this in all modesty, but I've thought about this a lot. And in 2017, I launched a website which I couldn't launch it until I had figured out the philosophy that I was going to use to structure it. And so I spent a long time writing an essay about what are the principles that I think might best help the country correct some of the ills that afflict it. And I called it Tempo and Hup. And so I'm going to take a time to explain it because why should I spend 40, 45 minutes complaining about the state of our mass incarceration in the United States and not have a proposal? And why not take the momentum that we get from studying the cultural history of the devil, the cultural history of hell, and its application to punishment, and not have a proposal? So I say this in all modesty, but it is the result of lots of reflection. So TEMPO is an acronym. It's not a perfect acronym, but it stands for the slogan, the more people help others, the more people help others. And it's meant to be a self-replicating principle that kindness is contagious and that we must make help the prime motivation for as much of our activity as we possibly can. And if we use Robert Sapolsky's insights into the kinds of difficulties that can afflict young people as their brains develop, why can't we understand that there are people who, through circumstances that affected them before their brains were formed, they need help, and schools and prisons should help. And if people can feel that they were helped by society, they will come out feeling gratitude toward society for the help it gave. We pay our taxes to fund the prisons, to fund the schools, to fund the government that makes the laws that regulate our behavior. In gratitude for that, people will repay the help they got with the help they give. And the contrary is that hurt people hurt people. And again, I have to tip my hat to my wife, Joanne Bernstein, who was reading the paper one morning and she came across that sentence and she said, "Hey, this phrase will interest you. This is your kind of phrase. Hurt people hurt people." And I said, bingo. That's just a great saying, and I owe it to her for pointing that out to me. It's been very helpful. So if hurt people, what's the conclusion? We hurt as few people as possible, and we help as many people as possible. Now, I think that these principles replicate the ethics of every religion I've studied without depending on any doctrine, because the doctrines are so hard to verify, they're matters of faith. But these principles can be verified by observing behavior. These are not better than religion, but they're independent of religion. They're rational. I think they're charitable. And I think if we assessed our laws, our punitive practices, our pedagogical practices, by these two measures, we would be moving in the right direction. So I think I will stop there. That's what I wanted to do, end with a recommendation. Anybody who can improve my program, by all means, let me know. I can be communicated, I can be reached on that website, tempoandhup.com. You can put a comment in. If you go to that website, please look at the introductory essay, which is called Introduction to Tempo and Hup. And you'll read my essay, but I've explained it to you briefly just now. And I will give you, no, I can't, because this will go to the web as YouTube. So I don't want to put my email there, but you can reach me through tempoandhup.com. And you, my dear group in Portland that have been with me, most of you, for 3 weeks, you can ask John for my email address. So I will stop and take questions, and thank you all for your attention.
And Alan, could you stop screen sharing and then I'll create gallery? I see Donna's sleep hack has a comment in the chat.
I'm sorry, John, I'm not hearing you.
Yeah, one, if you stop the screen share, then I can create a gallery. And then I was noting that one of the people online, Donna Sleepak, has a comment that she made, and I don't know if she wants to unmute herself.
Okay, I've done that.
Great. And
No, I just wanted to say I greatly appreciate your presentation and calling attention to the whole issue of crime and punishment, because I've been working with inmates for over 20 years and have learned a lot, and it's been a very meaningful experience for me. It's life-changing.
Yeah, well, thank you. I figured that in this audience, there would either be somebody who knows the law much better than I do, or who had direct experience with prisons and prison work. So uh, I'm sure, and if you have any references for me, things I should read, or thoughts of your own, I'd be happy to hear them.
Other questions or comments? So, pass it on.
I am a nurse, and when I was no longer full-time, I worked for an agency that sent nurses to a women's prison in Minnesota. And I did not work there full-time. I would work, and then maybe another week I would work another day. The women's prison in Shakopee, it's called the Women's Correctional Center, is an example of a place where women were treated as very important people. They were in lodges, except for the extreme people who were in a cell. A lodge looked like a dormitory, and they were not in a place that had a great big fence with all the electric wires on top. Nothing like that. You saw the sign and you knew that that was the building. And I was told that women don't try to escape. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So the nurses, of course, were giving out pills and doing stuff like that. They had a psychiatrist. They had a woman that was on chemotherapy. And of course, we saw her when she came for her treatments. I was absolutely shocked at how beneficial that center had done with their philosophy of care. I very seldom was in the men's prison as a nurse, and that was entirely different. Absolutely different. Cells, 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 cells. Oh, and the one more thing was the women that wanted the job in this center was training dogs to be dog accompanists for people. And they got paid for that. Paid hardly anything. But they would come with these dogs that they were training. And someday somebody else would use that dog as their assistant in their life skills. So anyway, yay for Minnesota women.
Yes, I know that there are those programs. Many of prisons that today are notorious, like Sing Sing, were actually reform efforts when they were founded. And it's true, I mostly focused on men's prisons, except for what I learned from Piper Kerman. And I know that the kinds of experiences you're describing exist. It's just that they don't show up in the nationwide statistics, which is what I had to use. There are also horror stories from Please. So yes, the exceptions are there and they're brilliant. And we have to emulate them, identify them, publicize them, and emulate them. And I know that they exist because I came across quite a few of them. So I'm delighted to do that. And the training of seeing eye dogs and companion dogs, that's one thing that was done. In the early prisons that I pointed to, the Cherry Hill Prison in Philadelphia and Auburn in New York, the prisoners worked, they made baskets, they did things that presumably made money that would help finance the maintenance of the prison itself so that the taxpayer didn't have to do it all. So yes, there are many, many variations. I understand that. And I'm delighted that you had the kind of experience you had.
James, you had a
Yeah.
question?
You brought up a statistic early in your presentation about how crime has gone up from the 65, early 70s to present day. And I don't know I suspect it's because of the illegal drugs, or that's a huge part of that. The drugs have become far more stronger and addictive, and the money involved, you know, tenfold is so very addictive, and a whole lot of money is a real bad combination.
That's right. And the other important factor is illegal immigration and the attention that's been given to that.
Anyway, seems to me that, or it might seem to me that drug addiction is so extreme in a lot of people that it's pushed them beyond our ability to rehabilitate them. That they're just beyond hope. You know, I drove in today, as I drove in, you know, when I come in on Sundays, and you see these homeless camps and all the garbage and all of that. These people, from what I can tell, are committing a slow suicide, and they're taking us with them. And personally, I don't want to go. So I don't know. I don't know. Do you, give them a chance to rehabilitate, which doesn't seem to be working? Or do you just institutionalize them? And I don't quite know what that means. And then, because they're a lost cause. I think drug addiction has created a group that is a lost cause. It causes us a whole lot of pain and suffering as well.
Can answer you with one syllable. Yup. I mean, that's a really tough issue. And I can imagine a person saying, suppose I could arrange to have all the homeless in Oakland, where I live, or Portland, where you are, picked up, taken to a nice facility, and given some high school or college courses, or a library of books to read, or films to watch, or music to listen to. And other people saying, why should I be paying for that experience for those people when I myself can't afford to take a vacation or make the repairs I need to make to my house? I'm tending my property, which every responsible citizen would do. I can't afford that. Why should my money go for those benefits for those people? I don't have an answer other than what I said in Tempo and Up. What benefit do we get from prolonging their pain? And I don't have the answer. And few of us do. Few of us would claim to have the answer. It's tough. I don't know what to say, but I'm glad you brought up that side of it because, I mean, that's absolutely correct. That's present, and we have to deal with it. And we can't let the people living on the street spread the diseases that they may get from inadequate medical care or by selling the dope to make the money that they need to buy the dope that they themselves need. I mean, that's terrible. But our attitude in approaching the problem might improve.
So, we're at 10:15. There would be time for one more question. I didn't see any other hands up. So, Alan, thank you so much for just incredibly informative and enlightening 3 weeks. You haven't been able to see everybody, but they've all been like intently watching. So anyway, but thank you very much. One just quick announcement before we close. The brochures for the spring classes are up here, and next week will be Elaine Park, and the title of hers the next 3 Sundays is Weaving the Word into the Fabric of Our Lives. So and you all know Elaine. So anyway, thank you so much, Alan. We sure appreciate it.
Thank you, John. It's been a wonderful experience for me, and I thank you all who are